Tonight we're hoping to answer our questions about what's being done to support refugees and immigrants in our own communities and how we can help the organizations that do this vital work. Each of tonight's speakers will give a short presentation and then open the floor for questions and discussion, I think. Maybe just full discussion. Anyway, Robbie Adams is the project coordinator at the Boston Center for Refugee Health Human Rights. She has a master's degree in peace and conflict studies from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and she has studied issues affecting internally displaced persons in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Southeast Asia, and has also volunteered in refugee camps in Greece. Cheryl Hamilton has devoted her career to advancing refugee protection, immigrant integration, and storyteller. She is currently the Director of Special Projects at the International Institute of New England. She's also the creator and curator of the popular Suitcase Stories series, which is a program that IINE that honors refugees and immigrants. Previously, she served as Associate Director at Refuge Point, as National Coordinator for Refugee Works, and as Director of the New Migration Project at the Center for Preventing Hate. Cheryl also directs Mass Mouth, a Boston-based nonprofit that promotes the timeless art of storytelling and routinely appears in storytelling productions throughout New England. Before we get started, I have two quick things. The first is that we've been collecting toiletries for clients of Robbie's organization. There are boxes on both levels of the library, and you can bring in your donations through April 7th. The second is that we have another event tomorrow night that we added after we printed our brochures for Wayland Reads. At 7 p.m. we'll be showing The Trials of Spring, which is a documentary that aired on PBS just this past Monday. It follows three activists who became the target of sexual and physical violence at public protests or after their arrests during the Arab Spring in Cairo. We'll be joined by one of these activists, and we happen to be joined by her tonight. Woo! Who will speak after the film tomorrow. So I put some flyers at the back for that too. So again, thank you so much to Robbie and Cheryl for coming tonight, and please help me welcome them to the Wayland Library.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming out. Anybody that takes time out of their day, particularly on a nice day after all this winter, we really appreciate, both Robbie and I. So what we're going to do is both just sort of take like 10 minutes and sort of introduce you to our work and the context of the sort of migration of people to the United States, particularly refugees. And then, like she said, just open up to questions. That said, I'm sure, like me, I don't mind if we're such a small group that if some point I'm like explaining something and you want clarification, please, like just raise your hand and I'll jump in. I do also have a cold, so if you can't hear me, please just like also raise your hands. Or if I talk too fast, really any of those reasons. So appreciate the invitation to be here. As she said, I've been with the Institute. I've worked for them for the last 4 years. Previously, I was spending time in Africa identifying which refugees were coming to the United States. And then I realized I was spending more time on the road and didn't have my own community. So I looked to an organization that I could really set roots in, both to help newcomers here, but also have my own community. And so I've been really proud to be with the Institute. The International Institute of New England is celebrating its 100th anniversary right now, welcoming refugees and immigrants into New England. We are based in Boston and Lowell and Manchester, New Hampshire, and we serve about 2,000 people each year in a continuum of services. There's a handout out back, so if you feel like that saves you from having to put too much information down, and also our website is on that as well to find out more. But I was asked today to talk about how does one even end up living in Massachusetts as a refugee. I'm going to simplify it a little bit, but if you need deeper sort of details, I'm happy to go into those. But essentially in the world, if we aggregate, there's about 65, 66, 67 million refugees, depending on what you include as a refugee and how much is counted and then, issues du jour. And the options available to refugees are not good. There are just not enough lasting solutions in the world. So let's say you're someone who has fled your country. You essentially have about 3 options. You can wait to be what's called repatriated, so return to your country, either voluntarily or sometimes involuntarily. Or you can spend time, as we all have heard, in a refugee camp or in an urban environment. So maybe you're in Cairo or Nairobi or another big city. most people assume that most refugees are in refugee camps, but in case that's actually not the case now. About 50% are spending time in both locations. Part of the reason for that is that the current length of time that someone spends as a refugee today is about 17 years. So there's many reasons you can imagine. If you're going to stay in a city, you might be able to access jobs more easily. You might meet someone that can help you. You might be able to be granted integration or access to citizenship, whereas in a camp, it can sometimes feel like forever. This is why there's children and grandchildren being born in some of the camps that we're talking about. And often camps are not, we're not talking about a 15, 10, or even 20,000. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people in one environment. I worked in Kakuma, which is in West Africa. We had 115,000 people from over 10 different nationalities in that camp at the time. And then the third option, as you all are familiar with, is refugee resettlement, which used to be much more robust. If you're following the news the last 2 years, you know that it's been reduced. Historically, in the United States, some people are like, when did this actually get formalized? Obviously, as a country, we've been welcoming refugees for decades and decades. But under the formal Refugee Resettlement Act, it was created in 1980 under President Carter. And he felt like this is a program that we should officiate and repeat every year. And at the time, which I'll go into a little more detail in a minute, he felt that the best organizations to resettle refugees are faith-based organizations, because he felt like faith-based organizations had tentacles into a community that would be naturally welcoming to newcomers. In 1980, when the Refugee Resettlement Program was created, you would receive 36 months of assistance, both from your resettlement agency, but also financial support and whatnot. Now it is 90 days of financial assistance from the federal government, and then extended depending on the resettlement program you're resettled with and what their resources are. So those are some of the facts. Now, the United States used to be the largest resettlement agency. We used to have the most people that we welcomed to this country. That did not mean that we had the most people per capita, though. I like to often quote that Iceland resettles more people per capita than we did for many, many years. I like to also imagine a Sudanese refugee ending up in Iceland and how that would be for them, not unlike moving to my state of Maine. But over the years, changed because of heightened xenophobia, heightened nativism, concerns about, perceived terrorism, all of these concerns, theoretically. We've seen a reduction in arrivals, and certainly under this current administration. I was running our program in Lowell after the election, and historically, the International Institute would have welcomed 650 people each year. But overnight, we lost about 2/3 of those because of the cutbacks in the reduction in arrivals, but also after that because of the ban on people from 7 countries. So that took a big hit. But that's all the facts. I'm a storyteller. I would like to tell the story of how someone actually ends up here through the story of Zainab Abdo. She's a young woman that we resettled in our Lowell office. She gives me permission to share her story. In fact, she shares her story often. Zainab and her family were living in a rural part of Syria back in 2011. She was a young woman, like anybody, studying in school, really looking forward to getting a degree and going on and studying. At the time, she wanted to be in healthcare. Her father was a construction worker. Her mother was raising her younger brothers and sisters. And as she tells the story, her big dream for her family was to own a house. And my father's an architect, so I think I really connect with this story. They had saved up money over and over and over again, eventually hoping to be able to move into their own home, which they were able to do in 2011 in Aleppo. And that was really exciting for them because it was something they'd looked forward to. And what I love is that her father really loves her and says, you get to decide how to decorate it. And she loves the color blue. So she got a blue couch and blue dishes and blue wallpaper and blue paint and blue curtains. She said it really just looked like the sky. And it was a big, exciting time. Unfortunately, that is at the same time that the crisis and civil war was accelerating in Syria. And that eventually came closer and closer and eventually into her neighborhood in Aleppo. I'm obviously minimizing and summarizing really quickly what was going on. But for her personally, she went from living in her first home in a very safe environment to being in a neighborhood where it was not uncommon for her hearing gunshots, not uncommon for her to see people on the ground that had been killed, not uncommon for school to be interrupted because of the violence in her neighborhood. And her father had lost her job because the government shut down the business he had worked for. So things became very quickly became very vulnerable. to a day, then finally she'll tell you about the day that she was in school and her teacher was arrested and taken out of the classroom for reasons the teacher didn't even understand, and certainly to the fear of her and her sibling and her fellow students that were hiding underneath the tables crying. She called her father, and that was the last day she went to school, and then she ended up trying to homeschool herself and study for her exams, staying in that home. Some people say to her, well, why didn't your family leave if things were getting so badly? Well, it takes a lot of resources to be able to leave. It's not like people are just like, I'm done, I'm leaving. They had spent all of their money on that house, that they actually didn't feel that they had the resources to be able to relocate, and they weren't even sure where they would go. But like many refugees, that became not a choice for them the day that their building was bombed. The first and third floor of their building was destroyed. The way the building fell fortunately spared part of their apartment where their family were at the time. The tenants on the third floor was killed. The first floor luckily wasn't home. And at that point, their building was pretty much destroyed. And her father looked at her and said, we're leaving, pack up your stuff. And that was the day that they left. And I'm really fascinated by the nuance of stories. And the piece that always touches me is when she describes that when you leave a city, maybe you can afford a car, maybe you know someone that can drive you, but in her case, they had to walk quite a distance to even be able to get to a bus that brought them out to a rural area. And I said, well, how do you decide? She goes, well, people will write on the walls of the building whether they say that street is safe or not, depending on who's in the neighborhoods and which rebels and which government soldiers. Now, you're trusting, right? This is all on trust to be able to leave your own neighborhood. So eventually she moves in with her grandmother and her many, many relatives in a one-bedroom house in a rural area. And then that became intolerable. They didn't have resources. They were running out of money. They didn't have enough food. So at that point, they realized that they had to leave Syria. So the family went to Turkey. Now, most of the refugees leaving Syria are in Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. When we talk about the United States being overwhelmed with refugees, this is not even comparable to what's happening in the Middle East. 1 in 3 residents in Jordan is a refugee, of the residents in Jordan. They were in Turkey for many years. The father couldn't find work. She and her younger brothers worked in a carpet factory, making enough money to be able to afford the rent that they were able to gain. And the minute you cross the border, now depending on where you are, you apply for what's called a mandate under the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which essentially says, I'm eligible for refugee services, should there be services available. In Turkey at the time, it was very limited. They did get some financial assistance for food, a little bit for rent, but it was basically very, very narrow. And while they had left Syria, her mother had been hurt on the journey that they had to make to get into the rural community, had hurt her back, which made them eligible for a medical priority under the Refugee Resettlement priority cases that the U.S. resettles. So, I'm still going. When the United States initially started resettling refugees in the 70s, 80s, 90s, we often chose refugees based on our political interests. So often you've heard of people leaving communist areas. In 1996, President Clinton said, you know what, if we're going to resettle refugees, and so few refugees in the world, should we not help those that are most vulnerable? Now, one could argue that all refugees are vulnerable, so then how do you prioritize, right? So in the Refugee Resettlement Program, we prioritize women at risk, unaccompanied minors, so people whose parents either are missing or have passed away, people with mental or physical disabilities that can't be treated in the environment they are, torture survivors, which you're going to talk about at length, and then people of distinction. That might be someone who's a political activist or a doctor or a professor, someone that's going to put them as journalists. People are severe risk. And so their family became eligible because of their mother, but also the conditions. Now, theoretically, the number of refugees resettled to the United States is allocated per region around the world so that at least everybody theoretically has access, but obviously that's such a small fraction. So they apply for their mandate, they get their mandate, they live in Turkey. Now, some people think resettlement happens really quickly. It does not. It takes 2 to 4 years, best case often, to get through the refugee resettlement process from the point that you've applied for resettlement through the multiple interviews you're going to have with UNHCR, either staff or their contractors, the United States CIS office, State Department, and then eventually be assigned to a country of resettlement. Now, they can ask for countries, but really it's not at their discretion unless they're resettling with someone a relative here in the United States. So those cases are called free cases. Zainab and her family were a free case. They just wanted to be resettled somewhere that they could rebuild their lives, recognizing that they would probably never go back to Syria. Eventually, their family was approved. So this is where the process on this side of the ocean starts. So you would like to think that a resettlement agency gets lots and lots of notice to know a family coming. That is not the case. You would like to think that. But you can imagine why this is the case. So what happens is, when President Carter created the resettlement program, he said faith-based organizations were best in the position to serve refugees. So there was 9 of them at the time. There was 9 national agencies resettling refugees, 7 of which were faith-based. So you've probably heard of Catholic Charities, Jewish Family Services, Lutheran Immigration Refugee Services, and then there were 2 secular. We're one of the secular ones. All of us have a national office that we work in partnership with for resettlement. Ours is the United States Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. Catholics is Catholic Conference of Bishops. You can get all this on the federal website. And those affiliates are the ones actually welcoming people and showing up at the airport. Now, they every year, working with the State Department, determine how many refugees they will resettle. And each state has to take a certain number of refugees. So it's basically a puzzle, right? You're figuring out how many people in every part of the country are going to be resettled. There's all these decisions around that. It's based on how many offices each agency has, what their capacity is to resettle, what the capacity of a community is to resettle refugees, what they're able to absorb based on a criteria of housing availability, jobs, ESL, medical. There's all these criteria that make it a acceptable place to resettle somebody. It needs public transportation, affordable jobs, all of that. So Zainab and her family, wondering where they're going to go, their case, 6 months before they came to us, was assigned to the United States Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. Then they looked at all of their sites across the United States, and they said this family is probably well suited for New England based on all the criteria I just sort of rattled off, with housing, affordability, with the size of their family, with the fact there was a pre-existing Middle Eastern community in Lowell, all of these factors. So they assigned the case to us. So 6 months in advance, we get a notification that says, can you, what's called, assure this case, which means, do you believe if this family shows up, you can make sure that they are self-sufficient within the time period under resettlement? And because there was 2 parents, and Zainab, by the time she would be resettled, would be over 18, making her an eligible adult to work and contribute to the income, meant that we approved the case. Then we wait, just like Zainab's family waits. It can take weeks, it can take months, it can sometimes take longer than a year, and sometimes, like the case when the Muslim ban happened, you might never get resettled. So everyone's just in a waiting period. And then we get 2 weeks' notice. So when they actually are approved, we get the phone call that says, find an apartment tomorrow for this family. They are coming in 2 weeks. The family similarly gets a similar, like, you're leaving in 2 weeks. Everybody is on 2 sides of the ocean getting excited for totally different reasons. So we got to assign Zainab's case. And our requirements as a resettlement agency is to make sure that they have a house that they can move into day 1, and we meet them at the airport. And then we work with them intensely for 90 days, because that's what the Department of State funds. And then we help them integrate over the next course of the year with all of our services. And then we have services up to 5 years, but the resettlement period is really considered about a year. I will never forget the family when the day they walked into our office. I was not at the airport for them, but Zainab comes up to the desk with her father. They did not know English at this point. I did not know Arabic. And we did the sort of hand signals that we do, and the hello, and the interpreter, and all of that. And they were, as many refugees are, grateful to be here, but it's overwhelming. And to describe the first week, the amount of things that people need to do in the first week is daunting. They have multiple appointments with us, with agencies, with Social Security to get their food stamps registered, to get their medical appointments and their vaccinations signed up. It is like, whew. I think the first 30 days, frankly, is like that, and then things start to stabilize. Well, Zainab, like many of the eldest children and families, suddenly becomes really taking on a lot of responsibility. It is not unusual that sometimes they learn English faster, so they become put in that teens in between, as I describe them. Often they're the ones that get jobs quicker, and it's just the nature of the beast. So Zainab was just like really running. But her father and she both initially got a job at Walmart, because you need to get a job as quickly as possible to be able to pay your own rent within 120 days. And as you can imagine, in Massachusetts, that is a costly amount. Now, a refugee is going to receive, oh, like 2 more minutes. Okay, so a refugee, this is the other shocking thing. After the 90 days and after that 2-week shock, a refugee receives $1,125 per refugee to survive on, theoretically, for the first 90 days. That is supposed to go to their first month's rent, their security deposit, their last month's rent, food, and all of the items that you set up an apartment with. As you can probably imagine, wow, that's not a lot of money. And in the case of Zainab's family, it was $1,125 times 6 people. So there was some cushion there to be able to ensure, but there still is a motivating factor that that money is going to, the federal dollars are going to end at 120 days. So she and her father got a job at Walmart. He kept describing her as, she's the leader, I'm the follower, which you could tell was a lot wrapped up in that. And then shortly thereafter, he secured a construction job back in his field. And so now he travels actually all over 128, working on homes around even this region, which is great. She eventually transitioned to Dunkin' Donuts because she was going to Middlesex Community College. And what is remarkable about her, like so many of our clients, is the amount of things that they juggle. At one point, she was in school in the morning in a skills training program with us for 4 hours. She would then take an hour break, go to school for English with us from 1 to 5, then leave us to go to adult education English at the local Lowell school department, and then go to Walmart and work overnight until 5 a.m. and then sleep 4 hours and do it all again. I mean, it's crazy. But she also became very much the face of our agency for several months, because after the election, we had so many calls from the New York Times and CNN, and everybody saying, do you have anybody that wants to talk about how this ban is going to affect us, how the elections, how people are feeling? And she said to me, I really want to talk. I want to talk about how I'm not a terrorist. So she, if you want to look her up, has done, Al Jazeera covered her, like everybody's done her story. Now, on a personal note, I do run this program called Suitcase Stories because after the election, we realized that so many better stories need to be out there about immigrants. So we started this program that raises the profile of refugees and immigrants and those of us who have been impacted. And I didn't know if Zainab would want to do it in the beginning because she doesn't speak English yet. Well, remarkably, within 18 months, she stood on a stage in downtown Boston and told her story in English in 8 minutes. It was just remarkable, and she was backstage, and it was very sweet because the woman up before her was from the Dominican Republic, and she listened to that woman's story, and she could understand enough to understand that that woman didn't know English when she came to the country. And she says, she didn't know English? I said, no. She's like, I can do this. And then she got up and she did it. It was great. So now she's about to finish up at Middlesex Community College after 3 years. She came in 2016. So in 3 years, she has had 2 jobs. She is almost going to graduate from Middlesex Community College. The family is self-sufficient. Her brother is at a private school. Her sister just got accepted to Boston University. I mean, it's a remarkable story. Now, are all families is that sound too perfect? There was a lot of hurdles in that, just like there are for everybody. But at the same time, I'm really glad that even though the ceiling has reduced, I think both of us would agree, every person that gets this opportunity, though, it's a transformation for them. And it's unlike anything. We wish they hadn't have to have it, but it's the only thing that gives people an actual long-term stability. All right, I'm going to pause there, and you can talk about the important specialized work.
Hello.
I'm not actually, mine's not even picking up. It's just for the TV. So you could just talk, but.
Then I'm not going to do that. Where should I? Just okay, like this. Okay. So thank you for having me again. I'm Robbie Adams from Boston Center for Refugee Health and Human Rights in Boston Medical Center. So we're a small nonprofit located within a giant bureaucracy of a hospital. And just kind of picking up on some of the things that you've said. Refugee numbers have lessened, but asylum seeker numbers have risen. So I'll just kind of back up to say we're a nonprofit that serves refugees and asylum seekers who are primarily survivors of torture. Our definition of torture that we have to go by is the UN definition of torture, so it has some real specific parameters to it, and those include that it has to be government-related, military or police that perform the torture. They have to be detained, held in a certain area. They have to be specifically targeted. So most of our clients fall within that range. I think it's about 94%. And the rest are also survivors of serious trauma that may have resulted from community violence, domestic violence, or other forms of violence that aren't government related, gang violence being another one. So I did bring an infographic, which is in the back, and a little pamphlet. I came later than you, so I just want to let you guys know that that stuff is there. The infographic's a little more detailed about our clients, if you like more detail, and the other one is more general. But so while refugee is in the title of our organization name, in reality, we actually see over 80% asylum seekers. I think it's actually closer to 90% at this point. And part of that is because of refugee numbers lessening. And another thing that you stated, people don't decide, I want to leave my home. That's not how this is happening. People are not just taking this lightly and getting up and moving. They're moving because they have to. They're moving because they have no other resort, and it's the last resort. And in the case of our clients, they've already been tortured or their family members have been tortured. So it's really a matter of safety. And so we see our clients primarily for mental health services. We're located within the Department of Psychiatry, but we also do case management services and career development. And just to speak again, the asylum process, we just heard about refugee resettlement. It's really not an easy process to be a refugee. Asylum seekers, little bit different, and I won't start a competition on what's harder, but
No. I would say asylum.
Yeah, I mean, there's no safety net. While the safety net is small for refugees, for asylum seekers, there's no real social safety net. Nobody meets them at the airport, nobody helps them get housing, and nobody helps them get jobs. So a lot of our clients, they show up at the hospital, they don't know what to do. We might be their first point of contact for any information. They had nothing prior to coming to our center. And now they have to learn that they have to apply for asylum within 1 year of entering the country. And then after applying for asylum, they have to wait 150 days to apply for work authorization. Then after they get work authorization, they actually have to find a job. But getting work authorization is going to take a few months. They might have thought, many of our clients do, that in the meantime, they're going to come here and send money home. But that's going to take a long time before that actually happens. So that's one really difficult wake-up call, plus the fact that most of our clients are dealing with PTSD, depression. Almost none of them can sleep when they first come. Terrible nightmares. Speaking of nightmares, the things that they have gone through is the stuff of nightmares. I mean, you can barely get through a story without it really impacting you. So unfortunately, I will not be sharing the details of the stories, but you can imagine sexual violence is heavily used, methods of torture, incredibly cruel, having people witness other people be tortured or having them participate in torturing others. Every layer of horrible things happens to our clients. And the reason why, most of them have been very politically active, or they might be targeted for who they are. LGBTQ is rising in numbers of people that we're seeing lately. I mean, that's always been the case, but especially from Uganda, which is the largest amount of clients that we have are from Africa, and out of that, we see a lot of Ugandans. There's a large resettlement community of Ugandans in the greater Boston area, and many of them are coming that have been targeted for being LGBTQ, or even helping somebody that's LGBTQ, or just being at a protest, just being present anywhere near any kind of activities. And also people's tribes that they belong to. There's different reasons people are being targeted, but one being political. Right now, in this environment that we're living in, you can imagine people that have been involved in some political activity. They come here after standing up for their beliefs, after standing up against their government, enter the U.S., and then are told in no uncertain terms, we don't want you here. There's a lot of rhetoric making people feel that way, which is re-triggering a lot of our clients, re-traumatizing them. And that works in two different ways. Some people aren't coming to their appointments, their mental health appointments, because they don't want to go outside. They're scared. They don't want to leave the places where they're staying. And other people are coming in more because now they're suffering suicidal ideation, or they're having greater issues with mental health problems that they've had. So basically, I think that the statement of, again, people aren't choosing to just come here, take our jobs, all this kind of rhetoric that we've heard. The clients that we see, over 50% are highly educated. They have undergrad degrees. Many have PhDs. They've been judges, doctors, teachers, activists in their home country. And they come here trying to start a new life because they had to. And they're very resilient and amazing people. And they just really need access to care. So luckily, because we are embedded in a hospital, that helps a lot. We can partner with OBGYN. I mentioned, unfortunately, the sexual violence that takes place. We have a really good partnership with OBGYN where they meet with clients first and explain what an exam is, and then let them come back for an exam later, because you can imagine that you don't want to just go into something like that after the trauma that some women have experienced. Our clinicians can do mental health affidavits, so we don't have legal services in our center, but we can have the clinicians write affidavits which state that this person does have PTSD, for example, based on their experiences, and then the lawyer can bring that to the asylum hearing and state this is credible reason that the person should not return back to their home country. So while we don't have any lawyers, we do help in that way. We also partner with doctors in the hospital that can do forensic affidavits, documenting scarring that people might have had during their torture, and that also helps during the asylum process. We have interpreter services that have 230 languages, so it's not an issue in that case either. And there's one of the largest food pantries in New England is located in BMC, so we can give access to food because a lot of our clients have food insecurity issues. We don't have housing, but we connect people to housing and shelters within the greater Boston area. We have a lot of good relationships with other organizations. So we call it a holistic program. We try to address all the needs of a torture survivor and address all of those best that we can. So that'll be my spiel so that you have time for questions.
And if once an individual has been granted asylum, they're eligible for the same refugee resettlement services had they showed up at the airport. So we would be working with them that way. And also for our resettlement program is a very small percentage of the other work we do with immigrants and others, and we don't ask for people's documentation in our English programs. We will in employment because they have to be eligible for employment, not necessarily in the pre-training. So our 4 buckets of work are resettlement, which we talked about, and then education and employment. So that's skills training in jobs like hospitality or healthcare. Those can be 6 weeks, 12 weeks, and they accelerate people's careers to get them, a higher wage. We have 6 levels of English in all 3 of our sites that require volunteers as well and depend on. And so people can easily move between the levels. So we might have some asylum seekers in that. But really for us, it's the gamut. We sort of say that we focus really on people within their first 5 years. And their third, that isn't to say there aren't people, some, but the third bucket is legal services. So after the election, one of the things we brought back was our legal services. We do forms assistance for green cards, for citizenship applications, because more than ever, documentation and doing the documentation applications correctly is critical. And we offer that at 10% of what an immigration attorney would charge somebody, and even a sliding scale. So that's something to get out there, because Massachusetts is actually one of the worst places with the longest backlog for immigrants needing these kind of forms assistance. So, but questions for us?
I just have a question. How do they decide to come to Boston? Like, what about going to other countries, or going, in Europe, or like I know Germany accepted a lot of immigrants, and
Yeah.
so how does that work in terms of where they?
Sure. So it used to be, again, I miss the 80s, oddly, not just for the leg warmers. It used to be like 35 countries actually had formal resettlement programs all over the world, but formal, like where we will go into camps, we will go into urban cities, we'll do these interviews, we'll bring them here. That went down to 12 back in the 90s or early 2000s when I got into this work. And now, literally, it's day-to-day looking at the policies of what these countries are doing. We've seen a lot of countries shut their doors, including in Europe. So Canada increased, which was great. Australia decreased. So it used to be Australia, Canada, and the U.S. were the big players. Everybody else was very small, less than 20,000, 15,000. So now Canada is, outnumbering us. But what's happening in Germany is a little bit different in that these are people who have come into Germany primarily, right? And then there's the question of making people leave or integrating them or offering them temporary resettlement. So it's a little bit outside of that, picking someone up and then putting them in another country. And countries like Tanzania, to their credit, they had refugees from the Congo and Uganda, or Burundians there for 25 years. Just waiting to go back, and finally they were like, this isn't good for the economy of Tanzania, it's just not a sustainable solution, so they carte blanche made everybody a citizen of Tanzania. And this is the big discussion in the world right now, like, what does integration look like? Because all these countries that are immediately affected, the next door neighboring countries, are the ones that are trying to figure out how to financially navigate this. So resettlement is very small, and I don't think that's going to change in this current administration in this country. And I think if we look at Europe, they're going to unfortunately follow suit for a while. Norway and Sweden has come down. It's not a good time for refugees in terms of worldwide welcome.
There's stories of people coming to the airport, getting in a cab, and the cab driver driving them to BMC. If they make it to Waltham without having heard about our center, then they definitely hear about it there amongst the Ugandan community. So again, that being right now our biggest group of people, word of mouth has been a really big factor in that. That also can be a little bit tricky, because when people are living amongst their own group of people and they've been persecuted, there's also sometimes a real threat of spies being in the group, reporting things back to the home country, and family they might have there being targeted still. So it's a double-edged sword of both being a really safe, welcoming place for people, and also sometimes being a place where people want to avoid. And we see that also sometimes with interpreters. A person might prefer an over-the-phone interpreter to an in-person interpreter, because they don't want someone from their country present in the room for any or imagined threat of spying there, but I think there is some actual threat threat. It's just hard when somebody's been targeted and is having mental health issues sometimes to distinguish. So yeah, in our case, but there's also lawyers refer clients to us, doctors refer clients to us. But why Boston in our case? That would be why. It's also known to be a little more liberal and open here. I think I've also heard stories of clients getting to other states and again being told to go to Massachusetts.
Well, so yeah, one of the factors is the healthcare system, health access and food assistance. Like I'm from Maine, and in Maine, general assistance is eligible to anybody, regardless of residency. So we had a large Somali migration because they were eligible for housing assistance and food assistance, where in states like Texas and others they weren't. So it's called secondary migration. It's where people are looking for resources, which has been their journey the whole time, and understandably. In resettlement, you are assigned to your city unless you're reuniting with somebody. And that's through that whole puzzle of each state has to take so many, each state has to have so many resettlement agencies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yes?
What about asylum seekers who haven't had major trauma? Where do they go?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure that I can speak to that as well.
I would argue, so, universally, asylum seekers don't have enough resources, for sure. And part of it is making yourself visible as an asylum seeker in itself, depending on what you're eligible for, makes it a challenge. But there's organizations like in Concord, there's Dignity in Asylum that provides housing to a small number of women who are in transition and need support, and helps them get long-term housing while that work permit and all of that comes in. But often the burden's the wrong word, often the assistance falls often to immigrant-led organizations that have been sort of percolated up because they've seen needs in their community. Exactly. Yeah, and that's been the case forever. And then some social service agencies, depending on what their funding is available. One of our limitations is that we are federally funded with state funding that is not eligible for asylum seekers. So in our case, we unfortunately have to prioritize, at least for resettlement programs, those services. And when I talked about that $1,000 essentially to each arrival, that's all we get to serve a client for 90 days. That pays for all of our caseworkers, our employment counselors, our English teachers. So it is a nominal, universally underfunded service for any resettlement and immigrant organization. So we appreciate public support, and we've been very grateful, particularly the last couple of years, by the outpouring of support. Never in my career have I been in a situation that we went from 5 volunteers in a site to 150 people on a waiting list. To have a new problem of like, how do you organize that? was not an easy challenge into itself. It's kind of stabled off now. We've got systems finally, but it was surreal.
Say that a lot of onus kind of falls on the individual themselves.
Yeah.
There's people filing pro bono, which I don't know if I should get into all the mess of that, but now they've changed it to last in, first out system of it used to be people would file for asylum and they would be treated in the order that they were filed. Now, people who are filing for asylum might be called for their interview within 3 weeks. The rationale given for that was that when people file for asylum and then work authorization and are staying in the country, they're basically living off our goodwill, because they're not asylees, they're not citizens, they're working in our country. So instead, now we're going to bring them up to an asylum hearing, sometimes within 21 days. Well, what that's done is people in the old system that have been waiting maybe 4 years for asylum are still now pushed back. These people that came in and were told, you can apply pro se, this is happening with our clients, are now applying, and oh wait, I haven't seen a doctor, I haven't established that I have PTSD or depression, I have no documents to prove that I have credible fear of returning to my country. Sometimes they haven't processed the trauma they've been through, and they're not even ready they might tell the story for the first time in front of a judge, and it does not go well, and they don't know that they can appeal for one time. So that's causing issues, people not being prepared on the 3-week point, and then other people being pushed farther back in the queue, basically. So there's also legal aid organizations that help people, and there's lawyers who do these kind of cases like on a scale, so it's a little bit cheaper, but they are way overworked. You know, there's just not enough help for this situation right now. So.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanna actually just comment for this from my personal experience also, because I'm applying for asylum here because I have to leave Egypt for life sentence. So about the decision that they issued a year and a half ago, so the process was long, and so my turn was a year and a half ago. I had a friend who applied a week before me, and then he told me, Handy, I got an interview, expect an interview soon, and then Trump issued this decision, and then I have been waiting for 3 years and a half to receive an interview, which I found really crazy, and also the first year of being here as an asylum seeker, it's really challenging, because as you mentioned, when asylum seeker comes, they don't receive any kind of support. There is no like medical support or insurance. There is no job. We cannot work. It took from me a year, because even as you mentioned, it's a longer process. So it takes a year. So if I don't have any financial support as an asylum seeker, if I don't have access to employment, if I don't have all this support, so how can I survive? How asylum seekers survive in the country without receiving any kind of support? So it was really huge challenge for me to survive for the first year here, and you know the process is taking so much time. So yeah, so I'm glad that you shared the work that you are doing. So my question is about like the legal support. So you said that you partner with organization, because also I serve as a board member with an organization that provides support for activists at risk. So some Egyptian activists who were able to come. It's not easy to come to the United States given all this reduction in the number of people who are able to relocate. But they come here, but there is lack of access to legal assistance. So you partner with organization that provide legal support, so they help them through the whole process. What does the process do? Prioritize some people, because I understand that many people will need support, so I just want to understand the process.
Yeah, that isn't really under my purview. There's a case manager that's worked at our center for 14 or 15 years now that has those contacts with the legal organizations, which if you had more specific questions, I would definitely be happy to connect the two of you. But as I understand it, she'll kind of summarize the cases that we're talking about, our clients, and what their specific needs are, and reach out to different either lawyers that might take the case or organizations like, I'm just totally drawing a blank right now. I'm sorry, Classic, but they changed their name to Denova. I'm pretty sure that's their new name. And other legal aid organizations to see who might be able to follow up on it. And that's just a matter of her actually coordinating with individuals that she has contacts with, or reaching out to these bigger organizations like Denova. But there's no special key besides that. It's really hard because they're sometimes just too overworked right now to take some of our cases. So it is a challenge finding legal representation.
So we don't have legal, oh, sorry.
I was going to say, I can give you the name of a Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights in Boston, and they but they could probably help connect you to. That is what the mandate is to do, to help with asylum seekers, any kind of immigrants in any shape or form. So I'll give you their name and number.
So we do have a legal department that does a number of forms, and the ones that are not, that we're not prioritizing because they're intense cases, we refer to people that we're familiar with. They're also, the state of Massachusetts has a really good multicultural directory that has all the services that are currently available to people, and so does MIRA, so I can make sure you have those as well. But no, I mean, like, again, the waiting list for these things are not insignificant, but also people who are doing them on their own are finding themselves in really precarious situations. So if you hear of somebody that's trying to fill out any application for, CIS, don't have them do that without some support. Other questions? Yes. Oh, either one.
What are the consequences for the refugees who do not become financially independent within the time frame allowed?
Great question. So a resettlement agency can't resettle refugees if we're not meeting a quota of success, essentially. But people are able to roll over to TANF and other programming that's available to them. But it is really, the emphasis is on employment. And so what we don't do anymore is resettle. In Boston, we only resettle single men because we know that the housing costs in Boston is prohibitive to any resettled family. So we have roommate situations so that they'll live together with 3 or 4 guys in a apartment, and they can get jobs quickly. In areas like Lowell and Manchester, we primarily are resettling has to have 3 employable adults in the family, knowing that likely 2 of them will actually work. And we anticipate out what the income could be at the worst case scenario. The combination of an entry-level position combined with assistance from the state, and sort of go from there. We've had some people who have certainly struggled. It's often the case more that they'll be with us for a year and then life happens, year 2, 3, and that's when things struggle. So then we're working like any other resident in Massachusetts with mainstream organizations and partnering. So Community Teamworks has been a great partner. They've provided us emergency housing assistance for some of our families. They've provided emergency food assistance. So, but it is not an insignificant challenge. And one of the reasons there's been a change in trends in the United States in resettlement is to more affordable places. What's sort of remarkable, and I say that with an eye roll, is that the stipend for a resettled case is the same in Fargo, North Dakota, as it is in Boston, Massachusetts. So that's why you're seeing a lot more resettlement happening in the Midwest, in rural areas. But a resettlement agency can only resettle a case within 30 miles of its office. But some agencies take that and do that. They just put families wherever that they can get within 30 miles. But the drawback of that model is that the clients need to be in your office, in English classes, in employment multiple times a day, a week. And so you're adding a challenge and a burden, and also they're separated from their communities. So our agency is one that's like, we keep people in the same community or within clusters, and that's another situation.
They're not forced to leave.
No. We're not sending anybody away. When they're here, and the idea is to help them. And one of the things I talk to about, particularly when I'm mentoring young people that want to get into this profession, is that you don't have to work for a refugee or an immigrant organization to serve refugees and immigrants. In fact, I tell people, go to the mainstream organizations, go be a bridge, help these organizations that theoretically are supposed to serve all residents truly do that. I admire the career centers, but I also know that the career centers are really geared towards people who speak English or have work documentation in this country, or their degrees are recognized. So this is another area that resettlement agencies often are trying to do a lot of advocacy around, and there's been some transition in that. The CNA program, really to the credit of the state of Massachusetts, the Elder Services and the Department of Labor all came together with the resettlement agencies, with some immigrant-led organizations and private companies to say, we have a problem here in Massachusetts. We have a shortage of CNAs. How do we accelerate this? So they provided free training to refugees and immigrants so we could get people placed rapidly. Oh, nice transition. It's not all bad. No, it's also one of the most, amazing fields to work in. I don't know if amazing is an appropriate word, but it's, there's nothing like connecting with these populations. I mean, for me, I always thought I was going to work overseas my whole career to go see the world, but I mean, the world is in our backyards, and it's just an amazing experience. So for us, we do have volunteer opportunities in all 3 of our offices. I will share that they are during the day, except for ESL classes in the evenings, because we have a small staff. So our staff also needs to go home. And also families are often working in the evenings or with their own families. So ESL during the day, we have volunteers in other departments like legal and employment. You can participate in those one-on-one. In our 3 areas, resettlement, and we've talked about this on the phone, there's a tendency to just immediately want a family. I want to work with a family, but the things that our clients have gone through, particularly during that first 6 months, it's an intense period for people. So we sort of we wrap our arms around them as much as we can, and we work with our clinical partners to make sure that things are sort of working. And then we start introducing people to more community partners. So we have a lot of great relationships with tutoring groups in the community. If we have a wait list, we connect with them. So I'll direct people there and say, if we can't use you, we know there's other programs there. But in resettlement goods, I know it's not as sexy to donate goods, but we need them so badly, because that $1,125, it's supposed to pay for their curtains, their blankets, their dishes. So we get a lot of donations from community partners to save and put more money in the pockets of our clients by collecting those. We also do collections throughout the years for school books and for winter clothing and for gift cards for food. I mean, these are ways we can supplement people's income as well. We also are constantly looking for job leads. So if you work with companies or you know people that work with companies, the fastest way to help someone ensure their stability is to help people get jobs. And so being a network and connector for us is really helpful. We have a lot of community groups. If they can't be in our office because of the timing or because of their own schedules, they'll put on events to help support our clients. They'll host welcome dinners for families where you have 2 families come and you have a nice dinner together and you get to know each other. And through that, theoretically, you start creating natural relationships with people and introduce them to your worlds. We have the Suitcase Stories events where bring refugees to your community to share their stories and, again, to try to raise the profile of people so they get opportunities. We had a great group in Winchester last weekend put on a concert, and to raise funds for our program. So money, time, and goodwill and advocacy, really. I don't think anything's going to change on the refugee side, but on the immigrant services side, any advocacy at the state level right now for more ESL, more legal services, more job opportunity training would be incredibly helpful. So that's one of the ways we can, here in Massachusetts, shift some of the support.
Do you have on your website and stuff?
Yeah.
Do you have listings on?
Yeah, exactly. Yep, exactly. So there's a sheet out back. We also have a monthly orientation you can come and learn about, because the opportunities shift depending on the populations and the needs. But we have at each of our sites, there's an orientation. It's an hour and a half. Come learn about who we are, what you can do, where you see yourself contributing. So for sure.
Very similar. So we, again, our clients, so they're, for the most part, not able to work right now or just in the beginning stages of working. So if you think, again, I'm sympathetic especially to the women that come into our center. They might be staying at somebody's house, sleeping on their floor, their couch, already feeling like they're imposing. And things like buying sanitary napkins, for example, that's not something people are going to generally feel like they can bring to their the person who's housing them attention. We provide things like that: toothbrushes, toothpaste, shampoo, soap, so basically daily use items. In addition, those people that are able to come with some of their children or are pregnant do often need things for babies. They need diapers.
Diapers.
Diapers are really expensive and just really a hard thing for our clients to get. So all of those. Also, we get coats and clothes for the winter, and so basically those things plus fundraising. So we're trying to diversify our funds as well. We also have some government related monies coming to us, which is always a little unnerving. So basically, I like to say that it doesn't have to just be fundraising. It can be an educational opportunity like this. We've had a lot of really creative people do fundraisers on our behalf, showing a movie or doing a yoga class and asking for $5 at the yoga class. We had an arts group put on an event where there were interpretive dancers, poets, singers, guitar players, and they raised $1,400, which goes a long way for these daily use type of items. We also take volunteers. I happen to run the volunteer program called Refugee Patient Navigators. It is also during the week and in BMC. So if you're located downtown or you know somebody who might want to do that, it's a pretty intensive volunteer position. I think it's actually quite unique because you get a lot of patient-forward contact in a way that a lot of volunteer opportunities wouldn't give you. We do ask for a full day commitment, either Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday or Friday, for 6 months. So we end up getting a lot of students as a result of that, or people who are retired or working part-time. But we rely really heavily on our volunteers because, again, when people come, I forgot to say earlier, we see walk-ins as well. We're one of the only places in the hospital that you can come without an appointment and wait to be seen by the next clinician that has an opening. So often walk-ins will come in totally bewildered or maybe really, sunken in themselves. They might be sitting in the corner, kind of depressed. Our volunteers make it a very safe, welcoming space. They make sure to come in and offer tea, water, snacks, just sort of check in a calm way to make sure that the person is doing okay and start establishing some trust in that way, because you can imagine our clients, one of the main things that has been broken for them is trust. Beyond other things, trust has been really, really damaged. So we try to set up an environment that is conducive to building that back up again. And I think volunteers are really important for that. So even if you're not available during those hours, if you can think of somebody who is, I think it's a really good opportunity for people to get exposure to this group of people that are amazing and incredibly resilient. We do have our career development program as well. We would also love to hear of job leads. And also for our clients, again, more asylum seekers. So we're also trying to set people up with volunteer opportunities and internships of their own, just so that they can get some training here in America and have some references here, because they won't have any of that built up yet. So if you happen to know of people that have opportunities for, adults, I mean, I know internships are usually thought of for students, but it's really helpful for our clients to have those opportunities as well.
Are you connected with any of the schools of social work for placements?
Yep.
Yeah, we're actually teaching hospital BMC associated with BU, and then we also have partnerships with Simmons and BC and
So, you just mentioned that you have to commit a day, so is the volunteer doing other things and just sort of welcoming?
yes,
them?
there's
Yeah.
so much for them to
Okay.
do. There's so much. There's, again, also very small staff, and so for us, the core staff plus our interns, and then our volunteers are helping, so the welcoming, but also navigating people through the hospital, making sure they get signed up for health insurance, taking them to the food pantry, taking them to other appointments they have within the hospital, helping explain some of the process that they're going to experience while they go through this system. So the types of questions they might be asked by clinicians and how often that's going to happen. they're called Refugee Patient Navigators because of the navigation part. They really help our clients through a lot of the process, in addition to smaller projects that we also always have.
We've had some people, again, I like what you said about creativity. I mean, we can't do everything, but we've had some people present some cool ideas, and it's worked. We've have a group of women and men that make lunches at all 3 of our sites, different groups, and they bring in food once a month, and they do a conversation, so they're feeding our clients as ESL ends and sits and talks to them. We have people that just drop off snacks for all the ESL students that are having to go from ESL straight to their jobs, so it's extra money in their pocket again. So there's, you know, I'll listen to anything. I don't know if I can make it all happen, but yeah. We recognize it's hard because these are daytime hours, but that doesn't preclude things from not happening. Part of why I started Suitcase Stories was people did want to meet our clients. And so Suitcase Stories is when we bring U.S. and foreign-born people together to share their stories about immigration. It started with just being a fundraiser because when the ban happened, we lost $400,000 overnight because we were $1,000 per arrival. So it was going to be a big hit, so a financial hit to us. But fortunately, through Suitcase Stories and through other people helping us, we were able to make up over $200,000 of that. And then it just kept going. So now Suitcase Stories, you can grab a brochure in the back. We do main stage shows. These are large shows for 400, 500, 600 people. We just had one at the Somerville Theater that had 650 people. And then we have shows in the schools. So we've had volunteers teams bringing it into schools. We just did all the 6th and 8th graders at two middle schools in New Hampshire. We're going to be going, we have several schools. We're doing all of Lowell 8th grade. It's going to be crazy. And so we bring some of our clients, some of our staff, and then professional storytellers, and they talk about immigration and the things that we have in common, not just the the outrageous story of something you may never have lived, but like making friends across culture, So we've got the school program, we've got community programs now where we'll do smaller showcases and we'll coach people in your community to tell their stories. So Needham is going to have one in June, and those are fundraisers, so you can easily help an agency like us raise $2,000 to $3,000, $4,000 by just selling $15 tickets to hear each other's stories. So, and then we're going to be launching a podcast, which is going to be pretty fun. So that's another way. If you're just excited about the arts and you want to talk to me, that's the way to get involved and meet some of our amazing people we get to work with.
Is there any organization that needs furniture? You said you need everything.
So we rely on Acton. Household Goods in Acton, yeah. I'm on so many drugs right now as I'm speaking. So for us, Household Goods in Acton is great. It's great particularly because clients can go there and pick out things, which is a sense of, independence and choice. In Boston, we're pretty much set up, but that's really helpful for us, and they're a great organization.
So do they accept from people in the public?
Yep, yeah, absolutely. Household Goods in Acton. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, you can bring in their
Yep.
things there. I'm not sure they'll come to Wayland to pick up.
Yep.
I know, yeah.
Are there questions? Anything else? No? Well, really, again,
Brought things, I plan to bring things.
Okay.
if you want, there's a sign-up sheet in the back I can share. Robbie and I can, if you want emails to either of our organizations to be on our listservs, just write them down and we'll share them with each other. But otherwise, just thank you. Thanks for learning about this field. Just popped halfway through. I'm like, oh God, was I yelling at them?